UN Peacekeeping Day. It is in this context that we have invited Dr. Manish Dabadhe from the School of International Studies, JNU, to talk in detail about this very important arm of the United Nations. Dr. Dabadhe, what is this concept of peacekeeping forces by United Nations, and when did this idea germinate?
It came out immediately with the formation of the United Nations way back in 1945. The idea is that we live in a society of states and there is going to be international conflict within the state and between the states. So UN, in fact, through the UN peacekeeping missions, actually sees this as one of its very primary objectives. If you look at the UN Charter, one of the core principles of the UN Charter is the preservation of international peace and security, and UN peacekeeping is in fact the most important way in which this can be looked at. In fact, peacekeeping, in the words of current UN General Assembly President, is international solidarity in its truest forms. So in fact, UN peacekeeping forces are seen as the human face of the UN.
So how do and when do these troops, the UN peacekeeping troops, they step in? There are conflict zones all over the world. There must be some specific point of time when United Nations peacekeeping force intervenes.
The basic mission of a UN peacekeeping force is to really stabilize the conflict and in fact look at it that how does one transit in that conflict zone from a war to peace and prosperity. The UN peacekeeping force actually is completely and only happens when it is mandated by the UN Security Council. So it's only when the United Security Council comes together and really approves of this mandate, then the UN peacekeeping mission goes in those conflict zones. So it's only after that. For example, today there are 12 active UN peacekeeping missions in different parts of, but largely in Africa, but also in Asia.
So what is the selection procedure? How does United Nations selects that we have to draw troops from a specific nation for a UN peacekeeping mission?
It is a voluntary exercise. It is in fact they are called blue helmets popularly, and it is completely they approach in fact the conflictual parties approach the UN Secretariat, and typically then the United Nations Secretary General in fact invites contributions from member states to participate in such missions. So it is an entirely voluntary effort by member states of the United Nations.
So we find that there are certain nations which are contributing troops in a large number, and there are certain nations which are like keeping aloof. So
absolutely, and in fact there is one can see a pattern in some ways that the richer member states of the United Nations in fact foot the bill, because it is really a very costly exercise. So you see that they pay with US dollars, and countries who really contribute, they in fact many a times pay with their own blood. So in that sense there is really a sort of not exactly a division of labor, but you see the larger contributions in fact come from the developing countries, which are now called the Global South. In fact, Bangladesh has, if you look at the 2023 figures, Bangladesh is really topping in terms of troop contributions, followed by Nepal, and then India is the third largest contributor to UN peacekeeping.
So we all in neighborhood are like trying to keep peace all over the world.
Absolutely.
The UN peacekeeping forces, they marshal themselves into a conflict zone. What specifically are their roles?
They have a very specific mandate which is again passed by the UN Security Council, but the principal job is that they have to stabilize the conflict. So it's not just peacekeeping, it's also peace building, and then it involves obviously building infrastructure, it also involves medical services, it also involves training civilian population, training civilian administration.
So how do and when do they pull out? Because you've entered into a conflict zone, and obviously the warring nations, they are depleted in all kind of resources, and they would want that the peacekeeping mission goes on and building their infrastructure and doing all those things, but it cannot be endless. So how do they come out?
Though they come with a very specific mandate to operate in a specific conflict zone, there is in fact one of the major criticisms by scholars and also people who are military personnel who have been involved, or even member states like India who have been involved in UN peacekeeping missions. The major criticism is that there is no properly drafted or properly created exit strategy, and in fact that is also creating problems in implementing the mandate. So there at times, and again it's an evolving situation. I mean, you just cannot. There is a genuine problem also that you cannot enter into a conflict zone and expect that within next 30, 60 days or 90 days it will end. It is a gradual evolutionary process. It involves active engagement with local population. It also involves, obviously, most importantly, active engagement with even conflicting parties. At times they are interested also in promoting the peace, and if peace can be held by such forces, there is also an incentive to really prolong that stay for a much longer time. In many cases, we have also seen that the moment UN peacekeeping forces are pulled out, the conflict has again resumed. So that remains a challenge. But again, it depends on the situation and the assessment of at the ground level.
Any such conflict zones where the United Nations peacekeeping movement have actually brought in stabilization and they have come out?
So there are many. If you look at in West Asia, in Korea, in Congo, then in Liberia, these are all have been successful examples where the UN peacekeeping missions have come in, have done their job successfully, and have pulled out. In fact, that is a very important template and a very important, in fact, goal of the United Nations, which they have fulfilled through the UN peacekeeping missions.
Coming to India, India has always been the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping missions and forces. How does the United Nations and the other nations look at India's role in it?
This is a very good question. In fact, India, as I said earlier, is the third largest troop contributor. So 6,000 plus as of now who are in different missions. And till now, in fact, if you look at the entire history, 2,60,000 plus personnel, Indian personnel, military and civil and police personnel have served in different missions. And in fact, if you go to the basic philosophy, India is the founder member of the United Nations in 1945, and in fact the first mission, India was part of the first mission in 1948, which overlooked the conflict over Israel in the Middle East. The basic philosophy is that India sees itself as a responsible power, as a responsible state, and in fact when it looks at the UN Charter, looks at the UN objective of peace and security, India sees that as a public good, and as a very responsible stakeholder, as a responsible nation, India should be contributing to that global effort. So India looks at it that way, goes into our Indian basic civilizational ethos about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that the world is one family, and if there is any problem, it is the job of a state to really help our international brothers and sisters. So that is the basic philosophy which drives India to take part in such missions. The second part of your question is how is Indian contribution look in the UN peacekeeping? Here you see a very important thread that India, because it's a democracy and because there is a respect of rule of law, that there is a genuine appreciation. The military personnel who are going, the police personnel who take part in such missions are really the best and the brightest of the Indian Armed Forces. For example, you had General Thimayya in his early days was part of the UN peacekeeping mission, who really became the chief of armed forces later. Then you have the latest one being was General Bipin Rawat. So it's really India's best and really the best and the brightest in the armed forces going and doing it. Same with Dr. Kiran Bedi. She also took part in the mission in Liberia. So that is where in fact they have made names there, and then in fact they have come back here and shared those experiences and have really risen to the top positions in their respective professions. So I think that is a very important learning experience, and India obviously because of their professionalism, the sense of discipline, so those values are very much appreciated by UN member states, specifically in the UN peacekeeping missions.
And we have women soldiers also. Not many nations can contribute the women forces.
Absolutely, I think that is something very historic, and that shows how India takes this enterprise of UN peacekeeping very seriously. That in fact this is not something which is a recent phenomenon. In 2007, we had all India women platoon, in fact taking part in Liberia security. In the UN peacekeeping mission.
We have covered largely most aspect of this particular day. Is there anything specific that you want to let our listeners No.
In India, there is a USI, which is the United Services Institution of India, which is the oldest think tank, armed forces think tank of the country. In fact, they have started a center for UN peacekeeping, where India is now training its own personnel who go for such missions.
That was Dr. Manish Dabadhe from the School of International Studies, JNU, talking about the International Day of United Nations Peacekeepers.